Good evening, and welcome to the channel. This is a little bit different from the videos that I've been doing before. This isn't about one particular book. This is a response to another video. Um, Steve Donoghue, and I will leave a link to his channel, is a wonderful YouTuber and book reviewer, and he tagged me in one of his recent videos with this. Well, the I want to believe tag. It's a tag inspired by the X-Files. And I don't recall the originator of the tag. Steve mentioned it in his video. I'll be sure to include a link both to that video and to the channel of the originator. Um, but yeah, so for for the people who are coming to this video, either from the link that I've left on rateyourmusic.com or who know me in real life and are watching my videos just, as a way to, see somebody that maybe you don't see as often as I would like, because most of my friends and family, well, most of my close family anyway, are in the United States, and of course I'm in China. Um, I yeah, I just thought I'd respond to that. It's an interesting idea anyway. Like I said, I've never done one of these before. I'm not entirely sure how they work, to be honest with you, but I'm going to give it a shot. So we have a series of questions here, each one based on an episode of The X-Files, which is one of my favorite shows of all time. I watched it all the time as a kid. Um, like I probably wasn't supposed to, at least in the early years of the series, because it did get a little bit scary, and I know my mom and dad might not have liked me watching it, but I watched it anyway because it was great. I loved it. Um, and I still do. There have been a few times when I've kind of set out to do a rewatch of the whole series, and I always get about to maybe the end of season two and think, okay, well, I want to take a little break, and then I don't come back to it, and then I have to start over from the beginning. One of these days, though, I am going to do a rewatch of the whole series front to back, including the movies, including the revival, including the spin-off series, The Lone Gunman, including Millennium, which I really, really loved the TV show Millennium. It was kind of a spin-off of the X-Files. Like there was one episode of the X-Files that tied in with it and served as kind of a backdoor pilot for it. But in most ways, it was more its own thing. But it was a lot darker than the X-Files typically was. But I really liked it as well. But anyway, so I want to get started here. First episode is about the pilot, or sorry, the first question is about the pilot. So I guess the first episode. And the question is a great beginning to a series. And to be honest with you, I don't read a lot of series. I've read a few. I certainly have, definitely. And, you know, mostly they've been fantasy novels. I've also read a few series of histories. The Caro histories about Lyndon Baines Johnson, for example. But uh, I don't know. I don't really want to talk about history too much, although that is going to be one of the answers that I have in a later question. But for this one, I think I'm going to stick with fantasy and say Game of Thrones, or A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. Um, I highly doubt that A Song of Ice and Fire is ever going to be really finished. My prediction is that we will eventually get The Winds of Winter, but A Dream of Spring, I don't see it happening unless it's something that George R.R. Martin leaves his notes behind and we get like a patched together posthumous version. I really hope we do see the actual ending because frankly, the ending of the TV show was a huge disappointment. And although I think the broad strokes are going to be the same, I'm sure it will be handled better. Uh, the later books in the series got a little bit bloated and kind of distracted by all the different directions they were going on. But that first book, A Game of Thrones, it really was a fantastic introduction. It really did a great job of establishing a world, making you really care about those characters, and then, of course, pulling the wool out from, or pulling the rug out from under you, excuse me, um, by, killing your favorites. And the phrase, kill your darlings, that a lot of critics and authors nowadays want to live by, and I think Martin is the best example of that. It's not always good advice. There are definitely times when it's better to allow a happy ending, but man, a Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin did a great job there of killing his darlings in a good way. Um, so next question is about the episode Squeeze, which, if you haven't seen the show, this was the one with Eugene Victor Toombs, who he had the ability to stretch his body in unnatural ways and to an unnatural extent. And he used that to, break into people's houses and eat their livers, I believe. I could be wrong about the organ. I'm pretty sure it was the liver. But anyway. So the question is, what's your favorite monster in a book? And I have to go with, well, it's a novella. So I think you'll usually find it packaged with other works, so in like a short story collection. But I want to go with The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. Um, I'm I do think that the actual, Native American folklore figure of the Wendigo is interesting. I think the modern creepypasta take on the Wendigo is also interesting, but there's just something about the way Blackwood portrayed it. In particular, when the I'm terrible at remembering character names. I'm sorry, you guys. But in particular, when one of the characters kind of runs off into the woods, and they later find him, and there's just something off about him, and they can't quite figure out what's wrong with this character. And then still later in the novella, they find the actual person who ran off into the woods. And it just kind of leaves you wondering, okay, so what was that thing? What was that thing that looked like their friend, that talked like their friend? And there's just something about that kind of I guess, the imposter that just, oh, it's so creepy. I love it. Um, and that's one of the aspects of the modern day creepypasta version of the Wendigo story that I also like, because often if you read those stories, on Reddit or wherever you get your spooky internet horror stories that keep you up at night, which maybe I'm the only person who does that, but yeah, they often have that aspect of, the ability to imitate the appearance and the voice of loved ones, of people and oh god, it's so creepy. So anyway, next one is the Erlenmeyer Flask. That was an episode from the what you might call like the mythology of the X-Files. It's one where Scully finds a baby alien. And by the way, I that's one of the things I love about the X-Files is how silly it is that Scully remains a skeptic throughout the original run of the show. Because I mean, you you literally saw aliens over and over and over again. You literally had alien technology implanted into your body. You literally became pregnant as a result of aliens. And you're still like, I don't know, Mulder. Do you think aliens really exist? The science doesn't hold up. I mean, come on, you know. At what point are you just going to believe your own eyes? But anyway, that's off topic. And like I said, it's a criticism, but it is something I love about the show and the characters, because it's kind of part of what makes them, who they were, and part of what makes the show operate in the way it does, is that it followed that. But anyway, um, the question there was, what's the best sci-fi you've ever read? And for me, this was a difficult question because I don't read much sci-fi. When it comes to genre fiction, I gravitate a lot more towards fantasy. Um, I don't know. There's sci-fi just never appealed that much to me. Of course, that doesn't mean it doesn't appeal to me at all. I have read some sci-fi novels that I liked, and I certainly like a lot of sci-fi movies and TV shows. But for this one, I'm gonna have to go with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Of course, it's you know, anyone watching this who is really into sci-fi might not like that answer, might think it's kind of a joke answer, but I think that's what appealed to me about it. I liked the humor, and that kind of was able to like pull me in. And but at the same time, it's not just the humor. Part of what makes that book great, and not just the book, the whole series, is the idea that like the size of the universe, you know, by virtue of the fact that we are looking at it through this lens of people who are explicitly setting out to explore it for the purposes of like documenting the immense variety of the universe. uh, it's it really does a great job of showing scale, and I kind of love it for that too. So anyway, next one, Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose. This was the one with the uh, I don't I don't remember the actor's name. I'm really bad with names, guys. I do apologize. But anyway, he had psychic abilities. He could see the future, but only in as far as it meant that he could predict the way people would die. And of course, this was the only episode to win an Emmy, and it was well deserved. It was a great episode. It also included my absolute favorite line in the entire series, and the line I always point to when I'm trying to convince people to watch it who think that for whatever reason they think it might be too dark, too grim, too serious. I always like to point to that to show what a funny show it could be. um, because there's one point where Clyde Bruckman and Mulder are riding together in a car, and Bruckman turns to him, and bearing in mind that he has the ability to predict the way people are going to die, he tells Mulder, apropos of nothing at all, there is no leading up, there's no conversation leading up to this one. He just drops on Mulder this line, you know, autoerotic asphyxiation, it's an awful way to go. And just the look on Mulder's face, David Duchovny, he's he's well known, I think, for not being a very emotive actor, but his deadpan broke a little bit in that scene, and I think it made it, and it was one of my favorite moments in the entire series. But anyway, the question is, what's the funniest book you've ever read? And you might think I would go back to Hitchhiker's Guide, but I'm not going to do that. Uh, I think the funniest book I've ever read is Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. Um, I'm a big fan of both Pratchett and Gaiman. I I always think of Good Omens as a Neil Gaiman novel written by Terry Pratchett. It's got the ideas of a Gaiman novel, but the humor of a Pratchett novel, and it works so well. It really is fantastic. Um, I also, by the way, recommend the TV series that came out recently, but you need to read the book before you watch the TV series, because if you're not already a fan of the book, it's not going to land for you. Um, but yeah, it's both of them are great. I and I love the, and again, just like with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's not just about the humor. There's heart to the story. You know, there's like you really feel for these characters, and it I don't know, it feels good to read it. What can I say? And also, it's just really funny. Um, okay, so next up, question 6 is Home. Uh, Home was the episode where the agents find they find a house in the middle of nowhere, and very disturbing things are going on. There's a very creepy, awful family in that house. And I'm not going to say any more because you really should just watch the episode. But warning, uh, it's rough watching. It was aired only once. You know, the rest of the show has been syndicated since then, but this episode has never re-aired on television. And oh, I can see why. I remember watching it when it first aired. I was about 13 years old, and ooh, um, I think a 13 years old is the perfect age for creepy, disturbing things like that to really hit you. But it was rough, yeah. Um, so the question is, what's the most disturbing thing you've ever read? And remember, I said I would come back to history at this point? Well, here it is, because the thing is, nothing nothing an author can come up with can ever match things that have really happened in actual human history. Humans have been awful to each other for a very long time. They continue to be awful to each other today. They will continue to be awful to each other in the future. And I say this as an optimist. I have a great deal of faith in humanity, but I read a lot of history, and there's a lot of terrible things going on throughout history. So the book that I'm mentioning here is King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild. Now I went back and forth between two Adam Hochschild books, King Leopold's Ghost and The Unquiet Ghost, Russians Remember Stalin. I settled on King Leopold's Ghost. And King Leopold's Ghost, of course, it's a history of the Congo Free State, the so-called Congo Free State, which it was the focal point of the first great human rights movement of the modern world, because even in the like late 19th century, early 20th century, the height of the colonial era, when atrocities were being committed across the globe by every European power, um, the scope of the atrocities in the Congo Free State was mind-boggling even at the time. And that should give you a hint at how bad it was. That's not to downplay the atrocities that were committed in the French Congo or in the British colonies of West Africa or in British India for that matter, or um, the Herero genocide in German Southwest Africa, what's today Namibia. There were so many, or for that matter, what happened in the United States and the other countries of the Americas, which by that time were all independent and were also all engaged in horrific massacres and genocides of their own native populations. So what am I saying? Or what am I trying to say here? Just the detail of King Leopold's Ghost. It's incredibly disturbing reading, but it's something that, as I said in my last video, we need to read things that disturb us. We need to read things that make us uncomfortable and make us question our own assumptions. And when I saw the statue of King Leopold come down in the protests in Brussels recently, I kind of cheered. And of course, this is not the only statue that's coming down as a result of these protests. Plenty of Confederate statues in the United States are coming down. Statues in the United Kingdom to slave traders are coming down. And that those are all wonderful things too that need to come down as well. But yeah, I based almost entirely on this book and some other books that I've read as a result of reading this book, I seriously started clapping when I saw the news article about protesters tearing down the statue of King Leopold II. Um, and for anyone who objects to tearing down statues, I would ask, did you object to the Iraqis tearing down Saddam Hussein's statue? Did you object to the statues of Lenin, Marx, Stalin coming down after the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of communist domination over the rest of Eastern Europe? Because that was history too. So if it's okay to tear down a statue of Lenin, why isn't it okay to tear down a statue of Leopold? You know, or why isn't it? If it's okay to tear down a statue of Saddam, why isn't it okay to tear down a statue of Robert E. Lee? They both lost the war. They both did horrible things. They both inspired the righteous anger of their people wanting to tear down their image. So what's the difference? I don't see a difference. Um, so anyway, I'm getting into politics here, and I want to kind of move on. Next one is Post-Modern Prometheus. This was kind of a take on the Frankenstein story. It was done in black and white in the style of like the a classic, you know, the classic horror movies, and yeah, it was a really interesting take on it. It had a great moment at the very end where with the quote unquote monster dancing to Cher, and it was fantastic. But anyway, the question here is, what's your favorite classic book? Um, I think I'm gonna go with Moby-Dick by Herman Melville. Although, of course, the question then becomes, what is a classic? I would say that Moby-Dick is the quintessential classic of American literature. But some people might define a classic by classical Greco-Roman literature, classical Chinese literature, classical Indian literature. There really was no classical period in American literature, but by the definition that we usually have nowadays, Moby Dick, definitely. Um, Moby Dick, it's there. It's like reading. It's almost like reading the Bible, to be honest. And there are huge sections of it that literally are like reading the Bible, and in the best possible way. The tone, the resonance of the prose is so amazing, and everything represents something, and everything you can just dig into the details endlessly. Um, a lot of people, well, I remember discussing Moby Dick the first time I read it and I never read Moby Dick in high school or university. I read it as an adult. And I remember talking about it with friends who had read it in high school and university, and they all hated it. And they all complained about the minutia of whaling terminology and, outdated 19th century zoology. And I couldn't understand that because those were the best parts of the book. uh, you know, how can you not want to read pages and pages and pages of, um, you know, Herman Melville going off on the subject of whaling? It's fascinating, both for the content and because Herman Melville is such an amazing prose stylist that everything he writes is worth reading no matter what it's about. It's, well, at least in Moby Dick. I've read a few of his other books, and they're not all at that level. But in Moby Dick, everything is at that level. Um, Yeah, it's fantastic. So anyway, Bad Blood. This was an episode where Mulder kills a vampire, and the whole episode, or he thinks he kills a vampire anyway, and the whole episode is told in flashbacks from his point of view and Scully's point of view, trying to kind of determine what really happened. So the question is, what's your favorite way? Well, it says, what's your favorite way authors have used flashbacks to tell a story? Um, I think I'm going to go with The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov here. Not exactly what is probably meant by flashbacks, but the scenes that take place during the life of Jesus in The Master and Margarita are really interesting to me. And the first time I read the novel, they kind of took me out of the story because they seemed unrelated, but now looking back after having read it a second and a third and a fourth time, because I think I said before when the question came up of what's your favorite book, I said The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. Um, that Wait a minute. Oh, okay. You know what? I apologize. I got mixed up. I talked about Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose, and then I answered the question for number five. So anyway, I'll go back to that because I made a mistake. Anyway, so I kind of go back and forth on my favorite book, and The Master and Margarita is one that often pops to the top of that list. But anyway, now looking back at it, having read it several times, I feel like those chapters are kind of sort of a meditative moment for the narrative that are absolutely necessary, and they don't exactly drive the story, but they're still needed here. So, okay, going back to four and five, because I realize now that I made a mistake. Number five was What's the Funniest Book You've Ever Read? But that was actually for Jose Chung's From Outer Space, a completely different episode, also very funny. Uh, and I already answered that. Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. Number four, Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose. I got off track because I remembered a very funny line from that episode. But the actual question was, what's your favorite book? Um, and my answer for that right now, and this is not 100% consistent, but it's one of the like three or four books that always stays near the top, is The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. Um, I would say, well, okay, I'll say The Name of the Rose is my favorite novel. I think my favorite book would actually be the collected fictions of Jorge Luis Borges. And that kind of goes together, of course, because one of the characters in The Name of the Rose is the librarian Jorge Burgos, who is, of course, named after and based on Jorge Luis Borges. Um, but yeah, I think the sort of mental labyrinths of both Umberto Eco and Borges stories uh, endlessly fascinate me. I love just getting lost in the referentiality of it all, um, and you know, when you read through an Umberto Eco novel, you come across things that you're like, oh, I want to know more. Is this something that Echo made up? Because of course it is fiction, or is this something in real life? And then you go and Google it, and inevitably it's something from real history, and you wind up going down the Wikipedia K-hole as I've heard it called before, and and just losing hours of your day reading about obscure 14th century heretics. And it's fascinating. And that's not to say anything of the book itself, which is also just a magnificently done murder mystery. yeah, it's great. Absolutely. 100% fantastic. So anyway, okay. Skipping back ahead, okay. The last question I answered, that's appropriate because the last question I answered was about flashback. So I just had a flashback from my flashback question. So the next one is about Drive. Drive is an episode where a Mulder and Scully are investigating domestic terrorism, and one of the suspects kind of hijacks the car that Mulder is in, and he cannot stop driving west because there's like almost a buzzing in his head. Sort of like there is an actual syndrome called exploding head syndrome that's not quite as literal as it's taken in this episode. But anyway, the question, it's a very like exciting, fast-paced episode. And the question is, what book have you read that's a nonstop ride? Um, I chose Beowulf for this one because, well, for one thing, I don't really read a lot of, you know, actiony kind of books, uh, with a few exceptions. But Beowulf, it really is a nonstop ride. It's right from the start. It's wars and monsters and fighting men and drinking, and an exciting poem. And I think a lot of modern readers get turned off by the fact that it is a poem. But yeah, it's an exciting poem, and there is never a dull moment. Beowulf is constantly fighting these creatures, Grendel's mother, and of course the dragon that later kills him. Um, and just the action never lets up. It's just such an exciting poem. So anyway, that brings us to question 10, Milagro. Um, what's it? Okay, so Milagro is an episode where a a writer sort of is bringing his book to life by writing it. I have to admit, this is the one episode on the list that I don't remember very well. So I'll have to go back and watch it, I guess. But anyway, it says, what's a book setting that you would never want to go to? And for this one, I chose another history book. But this one is kind of a stand in for a general theme. Um, the book I mentioned is In the Heart of the Sea by Nathaniel Philbrook. Uh, In the Heart of the Sea, of course, is a history of the tragedy of the whale ship Essex, which was destroyed by a sperm whale in the South Pacific, and you know very very few survivors made it out. Um, the crew was forced to take to lifeboats and drift on the sea. Eventually, they had to resort to cannibalism. And I said it's a stand-in for a general theme, and that is just being lost at sea. Um, that is one of my greatest fears is being lost at sea. I just that's uh, I mentioned the in the when I was talking about the Wendigo, that kind of imposter thing. This is the other one that would give me nightmares just to think about. Um, I remember when it first came out. I think I was in college at the time. I read another book on a similar theme, The Life of Pi by Jan Martel, and I wound up reading it in a single night. And you know that could just as easily go here because even though The Life of Pi, it's more or less an optimistic book, but just the idea of being stuck in the middle of the ocean with no chance of rescue, no chance of anyone finding you, and you know, just having to sit there and think about the end that is inevitably coming. And oh God, it's the worst fate I can possibly imagine. Um, so anyway, that's kind of a real downer note to end the 10 questions on. So I'm really happy that the tag includes a bonus question. Uh, about the song "One Week" by Bare Naked Ladies, which includes the lines "Watching X Files with no lights on, with Don LeMay's on. I hope the smoking man's in this one." See, I class of 2001. I know these late 90s, early 2000s one-hit wonder songs pretty well. And I apologize to anyone in Canada watching this. I know that the Bare Naked Ladies were only a one-hit wonder in the United States. They were much bigger in Canada. But anyway, um, so the question is, what's your favorite side character in a book, or who's your favorite side character in a book, I should say. And for this one, I'm going to go with the librarian from the Discworld series. Uh, if you haven't read the Discworld series, the librarian in the at the very beginning of the second book in the series, he suffers from a magical accident, being the librarian of a magical university. This is to be expected, which transforms him into an orangutan. And he refuses to allow himself to be transformed back because being an orangutan has certain advantages. Uh, and he maintains his position as the university librarian for the entire rest of the 41 41 book series, plus the 4 books of the Science of Discworld series, which do tell completely unique individual Discworld stories. Um, and yeah, he's wonderful. The Discworld series in general is wonderful. It's hilarious, and you know, if you're worried about fantasy, it has enough humor to keep you involved. But if you like fantasy, it has enough of a world and enough of a um, you know enough of the fantastic to keep you involved. And if you're not really interested in either humor or fantasy, it has enough humanity and character and just all the great things that you want in a book or in a book series to keep you involved. And I think the librarian, he's a fan favorite. Everyone loves him. I'm no different. So yeah, that's it. Okay, so I think that's my first tag. I don't think I'm going to tag anybody else right now because as I said, I don't really know how this works, and I don't know very many people. Uh, well, I just don't know very many people on YouTube to tag. But I will provide links in the description for both the origin of the tag and to Steve Donoghue's video, who tagged me. Thank you, Steve, for that tag. I appreciate it. And thank you all for watching and for listening to me blather on for 38 minutes. So have a good evening. See you next time. Bye.